so. Iminagenda 2 na legislaturehan is called to order for this special session, actually called by the governor of Guam, was called the legislature to half session today. And we'd like to start off with a prayer, and I would ask Senator Chris Duenas if you can lead us.
Please rise as we pray. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit, amen. Lord God, we thank you for the opportunity to serve you. We thank you now for this opportunity to deliberate and debate on the one measure we're called here for that purports to help the common good and our people with regard to this particular endeavor. So Lord, we ask for your blessing of wisdom, patience, understanding, and cooperation as we work together to see the wisdom in this measure. And we ask that you give us that blessing. In your name, Lord Jesus Christ, we pray. In the name of the Father, Son, the Holy Spirit, amen.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Muñoz-Barnes, if you can lead us in the recitation of the Inefresi. Nemastaculum Gihinasoku, Imastaculum Gicorazonhu, Nanimastigum Nanisinahu, Urfesen Maisedu Karabaiku Protehi, Zahu Dependi, Ihenengi, Icultura, Ilenguaje, Airi, Ihanum, Danitano Chamorro, Niren Shaku, Diretsu, Dinetu, Mustafa, Esti, Huatitna, Gihitinu Libya, Zanibanderahu, Ibanderen Guahan. Thank you, Senator. For the singing of the Guam hymn in Chamorro by Senator Tom Morrison, and for the national anthem, Senator Tom Adams. Senators. I ask the clerk to please take roll call.
Senator Tom Adda. Senator Tony Adda. Senator Uggan, Vice Speaker Cruz, Senator Duenas, Senator Limtiaco, Senator McCready, Senator Morrison, Senator Munya Barnes, Senator Pangilinan, Senator Respicio, Senator Rodriguez, Senator Nicholas, Speaker Wampat, Senator Yamashita. Madam Speaker, there is a quorum.
Thank you very much. Majority Leader, you're recognized to excuse two of our members.
Yes, Madam Speaker, I move that we excuse those members not present for today's special session.
No objections, order. On the approval,
Madam Speaker, I believe the clerk is still preparing the journal from the last session that just concluded, so I move that this item 7 be waived.
on that motion, no objections, order.
And on item 8, Madam Speaker, thank you. There are communications and petitions. I move that they be appended to today's session journal.
No objections, order.
Madam Speaker, there are messages from Magalahian Guahan specifically relative to his call to this first special session, and I move that the clerk be allowed to read the letter.
Can I ask if the Legislative Secretary could read the letter?
I'm
from
sorry, the
Governor?
Legislative Secretary.
Thank you. Si Diyos Masi, Madam Speaker. From the Office of the Governor of Guam, letter dated May 31st, 2013, to the Honorable Judith T. Wanpat, PhD, Speaker, Imina 22 na Legislatura en Guahan, 155 Hessler Place, Tagatnya, Guam, 96910. Half a day, Madam Speaker. Pursuant to my authority under Section 143H of the Organic Act of Guam, I am calling the Legislatura en Guahan into special session on June 3, 2013, to consider Bill Number 125-32, an act to appropriate the sum of $500,000 escheated to the general fund pursuant to Section 2116 of Chapter 21, Division 2, Title 5, Guam Code annotated to the Department of Public Works for the purpose of funding the acquisition of property for the Teason Parkway. The plans for the construction of the Teason Parkway have been divided into two phases. Phase 1, which is owned by the Guam International Airport Authority, consists of that property between Route 8, where Cars Plus is located, to approximately where the old GPD Records building is located. Phase 2 consists of that property from the old GPD Records building to Route 10A, and it is owned by several families to whom the property was returned by Ancestral Lands Commission. The Federal Highway Administration has set aside $5.8 million for the government of Guam via the Department of Public Works to purchase a fee, interest, or perpetual easement in Phase 1. However, the FAA is unwilling to consent to GIAA's sale of Phase 1 without reasonable assurances that the government is committed to acquiring the Phase 2 properties needed to complete the parkway. The FAA has requested that the government purchase one or more Phase 2 properties before it will consent to GIAA's sale of Phase 1. Accordingly, DPW has requested the appropriation of $500,000 to be utilized to start purchasing Phase 2 properties. The government has already contacted the owner representatives of the properties at Phase 2, most of whom have indicated a willingness to sell. Based upon earlier draft appraisals, DPW believes that the $500,000 amount being requested will be sufficient to purchase the properties necessary to satisfy the FAA. It is the government's intention to use this amount to purchase the properties through a negotiated sale, not condemnation. Most pressing at this time, the FHWA has advised DPW that it is required to confirm by July that the $5.8 million will be used to purchase the Phase 1 property. Otherwise, it will reallocate this money to other road projects on Guam. If reallocated, there is no guarantee when or if the government will be able to obtain another federal grant to purchase Phase 1. It is urgent, therefore, the government to act to acquire the Phase 2 properties as soon as possible in order to obtain the FAA's consent to the sale of Phase 1, and importantly, to ensure that the $5.8 million currently is set aside by the FHWA remain available for the purchase of Phase 1. We need to act now to ensure that there is enough time to negotiate a purchase before FHWA's July deadline. Moreover, as I am sure you are aware, due to the recent expansion of the runway at the Guam International Airport, GIAA is scheduled to close Central Avenue at Teton in September or October of this year. If we lose the federal funding currently available for the purchase of Phase 1, it becomes uncertain how long Teton will be cut off through traffic. Currently, between 14,000 to 15,000 cars traverse Teton on a daily basis. Any closure of Central Avenue will not only add to the already congested routes 1 and 8, but it will pose as a potential threat to public safety in the event of a natural disaster such as a tsunami or a typhoon. It is therefore in the public interest to move forward and pass Bill number 125-32 to preserve federal funds and to ensure that the construction of the Teton Parkway is not delayed longer than necessary. It is for this reason that I am calling the Legislature in Guam into special session. Madam Speaker, I thank you and Senator Ada, Muñoz Barnes, Respicio, and Dueñas for having already recognized this urgency in authoring and co-sponsoring Bill number 125-32. I hope that the rest of your colleagues in the legislature will also recognize this immediate need and will act accordingly. Don Coluna Siduos Maasi, Sinceramente, Edward Baza Cavo.
Thank you very much, Senator. And that will be, of course, recorded into our journal. Majority Leader, you're recognized.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker, and thank you also to the Legislative Secretary for reading the Governor's call into this first special session. So, Madam Speaker, I move that the reports of standing committees be appended to today's session journal.
No objection, so ordered.
And I also move if there are any reports of select committees that they also be appended to today's session journal.
On the motion without any objection, so ordered.
And under introduction and first reading of bills and resolution, Madam Speaker, I also move that this item be waived.
No objection, so ordered.
And under motions, Madam Speaker, my first motion, given the Governor's call to this first special session on the matter of the Teton Parkway and having him recognize that you have introduced Bill number 125-32 LS, and this bill was a subject of previous Bill 95 that you and several others have introduced and Senator Pangilinan held a public hearing on. And in the last session, you waived the public hearing requirement for Bill 125-32 since it was broken up into several bills, that being Bill 95. And so I move now at this point that Bill 125-32, an act to appropriate the sum of $500,000 is cheated to the general fund pursuant to 21116 of Chapter 21, Division 2, Title 5 GCA, to Department of Public Works for the purpose of funding the acquisition of property for the Teton Parkway project. And this bill's been introduced by yourself, Senator Tom Ada, Senator Tina Muñoz Barnes, Senator Dueñas, and myself, and I move that this be placed on the second reading file.
That motion without any objection, so ordered.
So, Madam Speaker, at this time, if we are in the second reading file, I move that we resolve into the Committee of the Whole pursuant to our rules to address Bill 125-32 LS and to have Speaker Pangilinan be the chairman of that Committee of the Whole since it's an appropriation matter, and to invite those individuals who are awaiting next door in the public hearing room. Namely, I see the Governor's Senior Policy Advisor, Attorney Arthur Clark, officials from the AB Wampat International Airport Authority, and if Public Works is there or any other individual wishing to participate in these deliberations, I move that we do that this time.
On the motion? No objections? So ordered. We'll
Madam
take
Speaker,
care.
can I just ask also if, when we're called to a special session, the governor usually presents an issue to us and transmits that issue in a bill format, and we appreciate that he recognized that the legislature, through your efforts and several others, have already filed Bill 125-32. Do we call this bill 1-S, or do we just have it still read Bill number 125-32? If we could just take a minute
I'm going-
recess so
yes, I'm
that
gonna take a brief
before we
recess
begin
and
the
we'll-
Committee of the
I'll
Whole, we want to
consult
know
the
how to
legal counsel.
properly label this.
Recess. Legislature is back in session. Senator Respicio.
Thank you very
have the
much,
floor.
Madam Speaker and colleagues. Upon the advice of council, the bill header will change so it will reflect that this was addressed in this first special session. However, it will still be bill number 125-32 LS. So having resolved that, Madam Speaker, we are fully prepared to now resolve into the committee of the whole and to have the Speaker Pangilinan be the chairman of this committee of the whole, and to invite the administration officials to come and make the presentation on this subject matter to which the governor called us into this special session.
So we will then recess so that we can bring in then the individuals into the whole for the committee of the whole.
Buenas and Hafade, todos hamzoni mangagi pago. Mangagi pago ni intero na komitea y legislatura en Guam para continuar discutir este inagangi betno special para spia empeños hasta para ekungo ki ginagagaw niya ni este manera ni Bill 125. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for joining us this afternoon. We are now in the Committee of the Whole, pursuant to the call of the Governor to address the matter contained in Bill number 125, which is an act to appropriate the sum of $500,000 as cheated to the Government of Guam, pursuant to 21116 of Chapter 21, Division 2, Title 5, Guam Code annotated, to the Department of Public Works for the purpose of funding the acquisition of property for the Teasan Parkway. The Committee of the Whole will entertain general questions on the bill itself and allow each member 5 minutes to for general comments on the bill. After that, we'll go back, in which we will ask any of the committee members, or the members of the body actually, for any specific questions pursuant to the subject matter of the bill. So at this time, there is a...
Mr. Chairman, just a point of inquiry, please.
Wait
okay.
till I'm finished, then you can inquire. I just want to set the stage. There is a handout on your desk from the Department of Public Works, which is entitled Hafaday, Welcome to the Tejan Parkway Legislative Briefing. It's available for all of you. If there's a specific request for the presentation to be made, we certainly will accommodate the body. If not, it's all before you, and you can ask questions, or if there's a member of the body who requests that DPW formally present this, I'll entertain that at this time. Senator Ada.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I would like to request that DPW make the presentation.
All right. We'll start that. We'll honor that request. Senator Ogden, you had another...
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Just a point of inquiry, because we're going to be addressing a funding source called the General Fund. And I noticed that, with all due respect to everyone that's up front in terms of the panel, because they're going to be providing some excellent information as it applies to the implementation of this, but because the funding source originates from the General Fund, are we anticipating anyone that can speak on behalf of that particular fund?
Yes, we have requested that the administration, in the person of DOA and BBMR, also be called this afternoon, and I understand they've been called.
Okay.
Mr. Park?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
So a DOA representative will join us as well. So at this time, we'll go ahead and begin the presentation of the PowerPoint. While they're doing that, please raise your hand if you wish to be recognized for general comments of the bill after the presentation.
Hafaday, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for having us here to discuss this.
If I may interrupt, I apologize, Mr. Dominguez. Since this is a matter of presenting the financial issue within the government of Guam, the subject matter of an appropriation, our rules require that the witnesses that may be making presentations be sworn in. So at this time, I'm going to request that each of the witnesses that are here please stand, and the Sergeant at Arms will just make that presentation. Thank you very much. All right. Thank you, and we'll go ahead then. Mr. Dominguez, you may proceed.
My name is Carl Dominguez. I'm the Director of the Department of Public Works. This afternoon, I'll be assisted in the short slideshow presentation by Jim Mishler. He's a consultant with Parsons Brinkerhoff, and worked quite extensively on this project. So, Jim, next slide. Just a summary of what this project is about, Senators. The Tejan Parkway is in the Guam 2030 transportation plan, and in that plan it looked at what the traffic would be like in Guam in the year 2030, and my recollection is that it was told to you earlier that there's like 14 to 15,000 cars a day that go through to the Tejan Parkway. And my recollection is that by 2030, that number would be at least 30,000. Am I correct, Jim? And so you can see, a two-lane road carrying a capacity of 14 to 15,000 cars a day, as the population and the traffic population of Guam grows. You can see that a two-lane road could not really take care of upwards of 30,000 vehicles a day. So the plan is to create a 4-lane parkway connecting Route 10A at the traffic light intersection of the Home Depot, and going up through Tejan and making the connection at a spot that is just about between the Cars Plus and the San Jose supermarket facilities there on Route 8. the second point on this slide is that the monetary savings to Guam motorists by having this parkway continue is in the order of about $2.8 million a year in fuel savings and travel time and wear and tear on vehicles and that sort of thing. In addition, airport-related commercial developments along the Tishan Parkway corridor is projected to add up to $59 million per year to the Guam economy. Next slide, please. Now, on this slide, you can see that light gray area to the right is runway 6 left. It used to be a 10,000-foot runway, but now it's a 12,000-foot runway. And that dark peach color is the safety zone, and the light gray area is the runway protection zone. And that those dark red lines that you see there, that's where the road closure the airport authority plans to do. And this is Route 8. This is called Central Avenue, and they'll cut it off at this point here. This, where you see this gray line splits, that's where the old GPD records building is right there. This goes on to the airport, and this goes on to that old housing area, officer housing area down in Tijan there. They are also going to close this road here that runs along the fence line here, and then this little stretch right here, Senators, is the road that connects to the traffic intersection where Mobile and McDonald's is at. So all of this is going to be closed off because of this safety zone here. Okay. Next slide, please. This spot right here is approximately where Cars Plus and San Jose are adjacent to each other. And phase 1 will take us through that grassy area, and then it'll curve over here and get down to here. And this spot right here is the split where the GPD records building is. So you can see that the road will go slightly behind the records building. In fact, I believe it'll sever one of the buildings. So that one building will have to be demolished and hauled away in order to make this work. And so phase 1 goes slightly past the old GPD records building and ends approximately here. And you'll see in these rectangles here, these are the lot numbers of the private properties that we need to acquire. So again, this is phase 1, and this is all owned by the airport authority. And then past this point, all these properties along here are privately owned. And this is what we need the $500,000 to begin acquisition of, these properties here in these whose lot numbers are indicated in these rectangles here. Next slide. Again, this indicates, Jim, this is the proposal. This large rectangle here again is just a repeat of the first part. It's just to indicate that this is the phase 1 that we have to acquire from that point up to that point there. And then again all the other lots are down here. There's a lot at the far end here, which is private property, very close to the traffic signal intersection at Home Depot, but that is not a property that was returned to the original landowners. We'll have to require that eventually as well. But the impetus is to get this $500,000 appropriated, because we really need to acquire this property in order to do phase 1 from the airport authority. And in order to do that, we have to acquire at least 1, possibly 2 of these private lots in phase 2. And in summary, here are the next steps. Bullet point 1, DPW will complete design of phase 1 of the Tejan Parkway in the fall of 2013. More particularly, Senators, that would be about mid-August. We'll have 100% plans by then. And these are plans that will enable us to go out to bid. GIAA FAA plans to close Central Avenue to allow use of the newly extended runway later in 2013. I've heard as early as July. I've heard as late as October. This afternoon I heard as late as December. Guam must acquire at least a portion of Phase 2 land from current landowners before FAA will allow GIAA to sell an easement on property needed to construct Phase 1. What I'm saying here, the rest of this, Senators, is basically it was in the governor's letter. The total cost of the Cliffline property at one point in time we believe was $3.6 million. This was at least about over a year ago that we had an appraisal then, but obviously we need to update the appraisal, and that's being worked on now. Hopefully that the final appraisal will be ready sometime between 2 to 4 weeks from now. DPW will complete construction of Tejan Parkway Phase 1 by late 2014 at the earliest. That's the earliest. If an easement for Phase 1 can be acquired yet this year. Phase 2 will be completed in the future following acquisition of remaining Cliffline properties and property fronting Route 10A. And finally, Senators, the only other thing really I want to tell you is that after acquiring the Phase 1 property, in order for us to actually construct Phase 1, we DPW have to go out to the market and get what's called a Garvey Bond. And this is a bond whose repayment is anticipated from federal highway appropriations, annual appropriations, to make the annual payments on the bond. And that's my short presentation, Senators.
Thank you very much, and Sidusmasi, Mr. Dominguez. I will go ahead and ask then for any general comments on the bill itself. Senator Cruz, Senator Uggan.
Just on that first point for the next steps, unless I'm the only one that has been attending the GIAA meetings and the DPW ones, I thought we've been talking about this parkway for 6 or 7 years, at least since I first became a member. And we're still not done with the Phase 1 design?
No, we're not. The first part of this program, I don't remember exactly when it started, was to get the environmental assessment for the project completed and approved. And that was June of 2012. And that allowed us to begin the design of this project. We didn't want to go with the design without first getting the environmental assessment approved.
Okay.
Senator Uggan.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Just in regards to some of the statements, I noticed that there is a part of your slides. I'll just highlight it, and I believe it's page 5. It says GIA cannot sell property for Phase 1 until GovGuam acquires property needed for Phase 2. And that was the Phase 2 component. The acquisition of the privately held properties was highlighted during your presentation. But what is the aspect of the GIAA cannot sell property? So are they looking at selling property or exchanging property with the private landowners? Where does that statement apply in this case?
No, it's not that GIA would acquire the property. It would be that DPW acquire the property in Phase 2.
But the way it's phrased is GIA cannot sell property for Phase 1. So that's where my line of questioning is coming from. It's just to clarify, will GIA be looking at selling property or exchanging property as a result of this overall project?
There's, if I could respond, Senator, the GIA,
Please identify yourself. for the record.
Arthur Clark, Governor's Office, Policy Advisor. GIAA would be selling Phase 1 to DPW or Gov Guam. So that's the part that comes out at the Cars Plus. So the problem is they need to go to FAA to have to get FAA consent. So FAA said they want to make sure if they consent to the sale of Phase 1, that Gov Guam is committed to acquiring the Phase 2 properties, which is the privately owned. So that's a transaction. Phase 1 is between airport and DPW.
So in that particular case, DPW would be utilizing federal highway funds to purchase
Yes.
the GIA property.
Yes, $5.8 million is what has been set aside. And that's the number that is currently at risk. Federal Highway has said that if they need to confirm by July, because they've had this money set aside for years now, and they're saying that if this doesn't get spent, then they're ready to move it to other projects on Guam. So they need to confirm that by July.
The chair's going to ask for that correspondence so that I can make it available to the members from federal highway funds. So if we can get those letters of correspondence.
Also, Mr. Speaker, if I can just ask one additional question. In regards to Mr. Dominguez, you highlighted that the appraised value in 2012 was in the range of about $3.6 million for all the private properties. Now, this proposal would apply $500,000 towards the procurement of 1 out of 6 lots.
One or more.
One or more. So just based on that concept, I mean, I would think that $500,000 would be equivalent to maybe a sliver of part of the properties that are required. How far has the negotiation gone in terms of trying to acquire some of these properties with the 6 individual property owners? I mean, $500,000, if you tell us that you were able to get a family to consent to the sale of their lot for $360,000, then at least we can be assured that 1 out of the 6 lots will be acquired. Now, if you're telling us that the least cost to the government of Guam in terms of outright purchase of private property is in the range of $600,000 or $700,000, then $500,000 is just not going to cut it. So where is the negotiation, Mr. Speaker, in terms of trying to identify what is your requirement in terms of initial upfront financing to meet the required commitment by FAA officials before they can consent to the sale of the GIA property?
Senator, we have not formally negotiated with the property owners. We are waiting for an updated and final appraisal of the properties before we approach them and make an offer to purchase the property.
Actually, Senator, if I could clarify that. Actually, we have had discussions. Land management started out with Monty Mofness was the one who initially contacted the landowners, and then of course he's on leave right now, so the negotiations have been taken over by Mr. Martin Benavente at Guam Housing. But they have contacted the representatives of the families for each of the lots, and most of them have indicated a desire to sell. So where we are at this stage is the price, and the price is dependent, of course, on what the appraisal is. As Mr. Dominguez says, is 2 to 4 weeks out. But we are basing our valuations on draft appraisals that came out about 1.5 years ago, and based upon those draft valuations, there's 2 of the lots. Let's see. I'm trying to remember which lot numbers they are. I'm sorry. Yeah. 2 of the lots, 2094 and 20941 combined, estimated in February 2012 at $330,000, and then another lot, 2097, estimated at $350,000. So we know that if those numbers remain close in the appraisal that's going to come up in the next month, then we have the option to buy any one of those 3 lots and maybe as many as 2 of them with $500,000.
So, Mr. Speaker, so going back to the request that you have forwarded to the members on the panel in terms of acquiring that information from FAA, would the procurement of 1 lot be sufficient to be able to allow FAA to proceed with the allocation or the allowance to sell the property? Because, I mean, if you're talking about $330,000 in 2012, chances are it may have escalated by 10%, 15%, considering the market conditions. And if that's the case, then we're looking at procuring 1 out of 6 lots with a minimum, possibly minimum total valuation of all 6 parcels of $3.6 million. So from the FAA perspective, expending $330,000 or $360,000 versus the overall anticipated cost of $4 million, possibly, would that be sufficient commitment on the part of the government of Guam to step in and allow FAA to consent to the sale of the property?
On that question, who will respond?
Frank Santos, consultant of the airport. In our discussions with the FAA and trying to build up the assurances that the phase 2 of the parkway will be constructed, we've decided that once one lot is sold or purchased by the government for the purposes of the Teason Parkway phase 2, then they will sign off on a request by the airport to the FAA, what we call release of property, which then would be sold for the perpetual easement from DPW.
So on that note, Mr. Santos, when you said we decided, is that the airport decided or you in communication with FAA?
In our communications with the FAA.
Do you have any formal communication to that effect?
Correct.
Do you have any formal written communication to that effect?
No, sir.
Yeah.
Can we-
Because I think it really boils down to that assurance, Mr. Speaker. I think moving forward with this project is certainly time sensitive, and we want to provide as much support as possible. But if they come back and they say, by the way, purchase of one lot is insufficient to meet the overall commitment of the government of Guam, then that's going to be a challenge. And because we're going to be right back here at this very same arena in about less than a week or 2 weeks because of the timeline that you're faced with. So it's just more or less getting that, even if it's an email traffic, or something formal to the extent where the $300,000 out of a $3.6 million, I mean, that's even less than 10% of a commitment on the part of the government of Guam. So I think knowing FAA and how they've worked and operated in the past, it may be a good convincing, or it may require some additional convincing on your part. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you very much. Any other, Senator, any other general comments on the bill? I know Senator Algan went into specific questions, but we might as well proceed with that. Senator Cruz, I noticed you had.
I was just wondering, what year did the airport purchase Area 1, and from who and how much?
Phase 1, Senator?
Yes.
Oh, that was transferred to the airport through the BRAC process as a quitclaim deed in the year 2000
Through
from the U.S. Navy.
U.S. Navy directly to the airport, U.S. Navy to the government of Guam, and the government of Guam to the airport?
It was directly to the airport, but I do know that the governor at that time signed on that deed also.
How many square meters is that piece of property?
For use of the Parkway Phase 1, do you have that number? A little bit over 60,000 square meters.
And that's how many square meters you're going to be giving up for the parkway?
That's correct.
And did I hear a figure of 5.8 million?
That's correct, sir. Senator.
And how much does that come out to per square meter?
Approximately $98 per square, or say roughly 100 per square.
And how will that figure affect the cost of the 6 lots? Is that how much you're going to be offering the landowners for theirs?
Well,
$100 a square meter?
No, Senator. Well, it's going to be based on the appraisals that are underway. The airport property would also be appraised by DPW and Federal Highway, but that has a short window of about 90 days, I believe. So once there's a trigger event for DPW to conduct their appraisal of the airport property, they would do so. But the airport is also, with land management, is also appraising the 6 lots The numbers that were mentioned earlier were from a draft appraisal that was conducted a year ago in 2012.
I'm just trying to figure out if you decide, if we manage to purchase a couple of lots and we use the $100 a square meter figure, we should be able to do a couple of lots. But I'm just wondering if you're going to be buying, or at least the airport's going to be selling their 60,000 square meters at $100 a square meter to DPW from, it would seem to me that we can almost tie in. I mean, that's talking about, you know, comparable sales. That's going to be the comparable sale price if you're willing to offer that amount.
The appraisals for both the airport property and the landowners for phase 2 are all going to be based on the deeds they possess.
But the comparable sales in the area is going to be $100 a square meter, which is the amount of money that you're going to be paying. I mean, that DPW, Federal Highway will be paying for the 60,000 square meters, right? So that's going to set the amount.
Well, certainly the benchmarks in the area would affect the price, but there will be assumptions made based on the deeds that are in effect. So the appraiser has to make that decision.
Okay.
So in regards to the deeds, are there any legal issues on the existing deeds for the phase 2 properties? Are there any things that would affect its current fair market value that would otherwise change the value?
There are environmental conditions on the property that were made a part of the deed, when the property was turned over. And then also there's the reversionary interest that was part of the original deed, because as you know, the property was turned over for specific development of a parkway, of a roadway through. So until that roadway is actually built, they are subject to the reversionary interest, so that the government at any time can take that property back as a result. So that would have an impact, I would assume, on evaluation.
So
I'm sorry.
So just as a follow-up question to that, obviously that would potentially affect the value of the property, but I guess my question would be, if they were to sell this property to any other entity, would they be able to get clear title for the property?
No, it would be encumbered with the restrictions that are contained on the deed. Probably most significantly, I don't know, I'd have to ask an appraiser, but I mean the reversionary interest itself would have a very significant impact on the valuation of the property.
So the valuation of the property is predicated on the road being built on that property?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Senator Duenas.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Obviously, there have been some requests for correspondence. I will hearken back to the fact that earlier you were sworn in to the veracity of your testimony. I would just like to ask this question, Mr. Clark. I think we're going to decide on this measure today, more than likely. Time is of the essence, so I'm going to once again reiterate the purpose for this bill to acquire the properties is we have the potential of losing $5.8 million to be reprogrammed, for which we could maybe never see again or have to compete for. Can I get that comment on the record?
Well, also I was receiving a comment from Senator Pangilinan at the same time. The 5.8 would be reprogrammed for other projects on Guam, so that it would not be available for this project in particular. And once it's spent on other projects, then to answer your question, yes, we don't know when and if we will see another $5.8 million or $5.5 million necessary to buy phase 1. So we would have to try annually to try to get new grants in order to do that. And at this point, I don't think anyone can predict what the likelihood of success is. But even if we wait just one additional year, then that delays reopening, because eventually that Central Avenue is going to close. So that's going to delay the reopening by that much more time. But that's in a best case scenario, that we could even get the grant again in a year.
So my follow-up question, once again, to another question that was asked earlier, was there has been a significant period of time here, but that has been on the willingness of many parties to basically not come to the table on this issue. And so time is of the essence to settle this issue at this time. Would that be a correct statement, Mr. Clark?
Absolutely. This is these negotiations and discussions with the federal agencies, FAA and Federal Highway, were going on since the last administration. And it was one of the things I picked up when Governor Cabo was elected in this administration. So it was stalemated, and then to be able to come up with this particular configuration, which we think is a formula to succeed here, it's taken a lot of effort on a lot of people's part. So it'd be a shame to see it not go through at this point, and potentially lose that $5.8 million for the Teason Parkway.
And just my final question, Mr. Clark, it seems to me that, and I remember this during the time that it was the back and forth between at least a particular member of the federal government not seeing the good faith effort on behalf of the government of Guam to come through with the final design phase of the parkway itself, and to come and to see through a decision on the proposal, and then also on the decision of how to bring to finality this acquisition. So that is another reason that this is a pressing matter. Is that correct?
Absolutely.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much, Senator Dominguez. Senator Tom Adams.
Thank you. I'd like to address this question to Mr. Santos. Is the closure of Central Avenue a foregone conclusion, or is that something that with refined negotiations might be able to pull it off? Can you maybe address that?
Thank you, Senator. Yes, with refined negotiations, we could have some solution, but we have to get past the first phase, which is really getting the release of land approved by the FAA, which is preceded by at least a purchase of one property.
Okay,
So
let me rephrase my question. Is Central Avenue going to have to close down in order for you to put into operation the new and expanded runway? In other words, all the negotiating that Mr. Clark would like to get into, could that basically change plans to close Central Avenue?
Based on where we're at with the construction of the instrument landing system, the FAA has scheduled their flight check to check out the system in August of this year. If everything passes, the publication of the new approach plates to runway 6 left will be in December, at which time Central Avenue needs to close. At the same time, we do have a project to rehabilitate runway 6 left, 24 right, that would go over 12 months. There's possibilities to open that runway on certain hours, but in either case, or in that case, Central Avenue needs to close.
The bottom line is that, and I guess what I'm getting at is, the bottom line is that FAA has invested $40 million, approximately $40 million, into the expansion of the runways to be able to accommodate larger planes in the future, correct?
Correct.
And when Gov Guam when the airport entered into their agreement to accept that grant money, it was premised on the agreement by Gov Guam that we were going to close Central Avenue.
That's correct. It's part of the grant agreement that was signed.
Okay. And so I guess if Gov Guam was not to live up to that, and for some reason we just says, no, we're not going to close Central Avenue, I mean, I'm sure FAA is not going to come in and dig up the asphalt that it has put in, but it'll probably take it away from future grants. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay.
They could withhold any grants that are forthcoming. They have a say in our passenger facility charges that we're utilizing to pay debt service. So yes.
Okay. So I guess that's where I was getting to, that it's really a foregone conclusion. Central Avenue will have to close down because of previous commitments that this government had made when accepting those grants to upgrade the runways. Now, this $500,000, and Senator Uggan had pretty much touched on it, the fact that the $500,000 appropriation is really just about 10% of what we're going to need to buy out all those lots. And so could we accurately characterize this appropriation really more as a show of good faith to hopefully then initiate further discussions and hopefully get this thing off the table so that DPW can then go towards completing its design for phase 1 and hopefully get the construction wheel started. And I guess I addressed that to Mr. Clark.
Senator, yes, it's a show of good faith to FAA, and which is necessary to preserve that $5.8 million. So yes, it's a show of good faith, but also, it's what we need to keep that federal highway money available for this project.
And just so that I make sure that I heard correctly, you indicated that there's been discussions already with the 6 estates that are involved in this, and that there's been an indication of willingness on their part to enter into some negotiated sale, a mutual agreement, unlike the situation the government got into at Lazon. Is that correct?
That's correct, but not all the families have indicated. And again, that was Land Management and Guam Housing, but it's at least 4 families have indicated their willingness to sell. And the families at that price range we're talking about, $500,000, the Santos family, I think in particular, was one of those families, and that's why we have this number. But yes, this would be a negotiated sale, not like Lazon, where it was a forced sale, which allowed the sellers to come back later and challenge the price.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Senator William Barnes, did you have a question?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I guess I just want to touch on Mr. Santos's comment in reference to what was just being said and the commitment to at least purchasing 1 property. We're talking about, that's 9 lots, 6 estates, and if we commit to 1, then we will not lose the funding?
Well, the funding that is being that's relevant is the federal highway funding.
Right.
But in order to provide the FAA the assurance that GovGuam is going to eventually construct phase 2, that 1 lot is that assurance.
Is that assurance. Now, if this happens today, will an MOU or an MOA between FAA and Federal Highways be put down so that there's an understanding? Because it's not like we haven't gone through this years before and situations have changed.
Yeah.
So what are the guarantees based if the good faith effort is being done if this gets passed into law? What will be done on their part?
From the FAA?
Both sides.
Oh, okay. Well, from the FAA standpoint,
Maybe you and Carl could answer this.
we do federal highway, I'll do airport. From the federal FAA standpoint is when this law or this bill is passed into law, the GovGuam negotiating team would then eventually enter into a purchase agreement with the landowner, at which time that is the trigger for the airport to submit to the FAA a request for release of property. Also at that time, we would have DPW would be completing or would have completed their appraisal of the airport property, so we know what the value would be. Following that, there will be a execution of a perpetual easement, and the phase 1 Deaton Parkway is, in terms of its documentation, is complete.
And Senator, from the DPW side, we would be eager to sign an MOU to the effect that FAA would release the property in Phase 1. You know, so it's really on the FAA side. We would be eager to execute an MOA to take Phase 1 property. So.
I'm sorry, one thing I was going to say that also is I think the money, the federal highway money, Carl, you can correct me, has already been identified. So this 5.8 is already identified, Jim, is that
Yes.
the case? By
Yes.
federal highway. So to answer the other, actually, Senator Barnes' question, there's already, you know, under the federal guidelines or whatever, the Federal Register, the monies have been identified as being used for this project. So we don't need the additional assurances from Federal Highway that the 5.8 is available. It's just, it's the fact that they've given us a July deadline to continue, that they're going to continue holding on to this money.
Do you have a follow-up on the question? Okay. On the follow-ups, Senator Uggan, then I have Speaker Pangilinan.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Actually, just a general comment because my request for follow-up information, written documentation, was to make sure that we have all the necessary reinforcements in terms of coming back to this table and asking for additional resources down the road. That's the purpose. It was not in any way, shape, or form, and Madam Speaker Wampat, it is not in any way, shape, or form to derail the action of this body on this measure at this time. So I just wanted to provide that, Madam Chair, as a clarification, because we understand the time sensitivity nature of this. We understand that within a very short period of time that this property has to be acquired, or at least a portion of the property has to be acquired so that it would allow the authorization by FAA as well as the coordination with DPW, the Federal Highway Administration, to proceed with some of these projects. And I think that it was highlighted that initial discussions and conversations had commenced on this particular project many years ago, and certainly I'm hopeful that we can proceed, you know, within the restricted timelines in terms of making that commitment. So I wanted, Madam Chair, to provide that clarification because the nature of my question was not to in any way, shape, or form delay any action of this measure. Thank you very much, Madam Chair.
You're welcome. Speaker Pangilinan.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Madam Chair, I rise to a point of order here with regards to the presentation of the bill. 2107 2GCA Chapter 2 in the legal requirements for consideration of land bills by the legislature requires that the land bills be accompanied by two appraisals. So if we already know which property we want to acquire, if we have negotiated this, then in order for the legislature to consider that properly, the bill itself must be accompanied by the appraisals. Now, I hear draft appraisal, I hear appraisal is going to be ready in 2 weeks, 1 month. So, Madam Speaker, in that regard, I just think it's a little premature at this time, and it's not in conformance with statute that the legislature act on this without those appraisals. And if we are indeed very, very close to these, getting these appraisals finalized within the next couple of weeks, then I would think that, the proper course of action would be for the body to defer action on this bill as required by law until we are able to get those appraisals to be presented to the legislature. Again, that's just the requirement of law. I'm not quoting anything. I mean, that's what is required by statute in order for the legislature to consider bills that seek to acquire government land as such. So, Mr. Clark,
Can I respond to that?
Yes.
No, thank you. Well, actually, all the appropriation does is makes the money available. I mean, the government of Guam, acting through its agencies here, would still need to comply with the law. So which is why we brought up the appraisal as an issue here, because we would not be able to move forward with the purchase without the appraisal. And so it's incumbent on the government to continue following the law in this process, but I don't think it's necessary as an appropriation measure to have the money available for the government to utilize because we haven't set a price, and that price again is going to be conditioned and contingent on these appraisals requirements being satisfied as per law. So I would respectfully disagree that that action on this measure is premature at this point.
I disagree with your interpretation of the law. I think it is required that the legislature is acting to basically approve by appropriating the money for the acquisition of the property, and therefore appraisals are required by the statutes. And again, you know, we may disagree on that opinion. I'm citing the statute. I believe that it is required. And I just, so, I mean, that's my position on this thing. I think it's a little bit premature. I think the administration's done a lot of work, probably has moved this further along than most have. And if we are 1 or 2 weeks away from getting those appraisals, you know, then I would think that it would be prudent for the legislature. We're supposed to go into session in another 2 weeks on the 17th of June. If the administration can facilitate the conclusion of those appraisals, we can come right back here on the 17th when we're in regular session and address this appropriation. So I'm going to consider, you know, that, I guess, as once we conclude the discussion in the committee as a whole, as possible consideration by this body. The other concern I have, of course, is, and I am very, very concerned because, you know, we're saying we're going to put out $500,000 to buy one sliver of 6 lots that were needed, and where is the rest of the money going to come from? The legislature, I believe, has shown good faith to the federal government with regards to the Tejan Parkway by passing the authorization for Garvey bonds. And if you recall, the Garvey bonds are supposed to, as Mr. Clark has mentioned, fund the construction of the parkway itself. So what good is it to, at this time, buy the property using the $5.8 million when we don't have the construction money? Why hasn't the administration, which had the authority pursuant to the last budget bill, I think it was in the last budget bill, Senator Atta, I think, had placed that meeting the requirements of our standing rules. Why hasn't the administration moved, which could resolve the issue of acquisition of all the properties required and the construction of the parkway itself using the Garvey bond proceeds?
If I could respond.
Please.
First of all, on the two issues, again, getting back to the requirement for appraisal, I don't have, well, here it is. Okay. Again, Senator, I would respectfully disagree that the language here is intended to supersede the current law relative to appraisals, but to the extent that that is a concern, again, I don't think it's premature. I think if it needs to be indicated as a condition that, you know, all other laws relative to the acquisition will be followed, then, you know, that could be put in there, but we can certainly act on that. As far as coming back in June, again, the deadline that we are faced with here is the July deadline that's been indicated to us by Federal Highway, which is the date by which they have to, I guess the office in Hawaii needs to report back to their superiors about whether to keep this money available for this project, and they need to have some indication that the project is moving forward. Otherwise, it just gets taken off the table. Yes, it's used for other projects on the island, but it's not going to be used for this project, and in which case, airport moves forward with the closure of Central Avenue, and then it stays closed until we can find the money to come back and acquire phase one. And when you talk about the Garvey issues, I'm going to ask Carl to respond to that, but I expect there's probably a difference in the Garvey bonds being used for acquisition versus for construction. But
No, Senator, the Garvey bonds are intended just for the construction of the parkway. We've been assured by Agita that they can expedite the floating of a Garvey bond. They told me that they're optimistic they can get it as quickly as within a month of going out to market.
Again, the idea of floating that, passing that authorization last year was to move forward on that, because it's not the only project. But again, you're saying that the plan is that the Garvey Bond is going to fund the construction. And is there a restriction on funding all the required acquisition of property using the Garvey Bond proceeds?
I don't know the answer now.
The federal government, whether it be federal highway or FA, will not be able to fund those 6 properties, simply because initially the federal government did quit claim those properties to Guam for the purpose of transportation.
Yes, but once we receive our federal funds and go out and dedicate for the repayment of those, I would think that the federal government, that those bond proceeds become local government funds, and we can program them for whatever we desire. And if we say, as approved by our TTIP plan, that phase 1 and the acquisition and the construction is going to be, and phase that the parkway itself will be funded from the proceeds, then I don't know that would be a restriction based on the proceeds of the Garvey Bond. Do we have any kind of ruling on that? Or you're making that statement, but under what premise, based on the fact that we're using the proceeds of the Garvey Bond? Is that was that a specific discussion?
But then, Senator, would we be using $5.8 million of a Garvey bond to fund the shortfall in acquisition? That's $5.8 million that can go to
That will
additional
go to the
construction.
project, yeah.
Instead, we're using it for acquisition when we already have $5.8 million that's not Garvey bond related. That's actually a grant that's sitting on the table right now for us.
But that's federal highway funds.
That is federal highway funds,
Right. That's what we're using to back the Garvey bonds.
No, the 5.8 is the money that's available now by the. And actually, I'm going to ask Carl and Jim to listen to this, so I'm not speaking out of school here.
I'd like to defer this to Jim Mishler. He remembers this from a couple of years ago, and
Okay.
I wasn't aware of this, but he has some information he'd like to impart.
I'm Jim Mishler with Parsons Brinkerhoff, working with DPW. Because the federal government gave the land for Teason Parkway to the government of Guam, they will not allow for any federal funds to be used to acquire property needed to construct Teason Parkway, because the government of Guam gave the property to the heirs of ancestral landowners. However, an exception was made for Phase 1 because the original alignment of Phase 1 was going to run around the officer housing area and would involve a very expensive 1,000-foot long, 50-foot high concrete retaining wall along the Teason Cliff line in order to build Teason Parkway on its originally intended alignment. By moving the alignment of the roadway back from the cliff in the Phase 1 area and onto airport property, the construction cost for that project dropped by about $5.8 million. Therefore, the case could be made to FHWA that federal money could be used to acquire the property from the airport for the alternative 4 alignment on airport property instead of out along the cliff, up to $5.8 million, up to the value of the construction cost savings that's realized by changing the alignment. That same argument doesn't work along the cliff line, where the properties in question need to be acquired using government of Guam funds.
And then, Senator, to finish what I was saying.
But
also.
it has nothing to do with the Garvey Bond and use of proceeds. I just don't, that was my question.
Okay.
And you said you had a clarification of, can we use the proceeds of the Garvey bonds, which now become basically local funds
But
But
to finish my point, Senator, we'd be using $5.8 million of those local funds for acquisition and basically giving up $5.8 million of this grant money that's available right now from the federal government. So we would.
No,
you
no, we
know, I
won't.
mean,
There's other constructions that we could do for 5.8. Either way, the money's going to get spent on Guam. So whether we use the Garvey Bond proceeds or we use the 5.8, we can still use that 5.8 on other GovGuam projects, other vitally needed road construction projects on Guam. And either that or we do the Garvey Bond and we take 5.8 million for the Garvey Bond and do it for another project and put that in here. So either way you move it, the 5.8 is not lost. You know, if we're able to use it as part of the construction, that's great because we'd have an additional 5.8 freed up in the Garvey Bond proceeds for other construction projects. If we use everything under the Garvey Bond projects, then we have 5.8 million of federal highway funds we can use on other approved federal highway projects on Guam, which there are many. And certainly we could consume that 5.8 million and use it well and wisely on other projects as well.
But then we lose access to the property. We lose access across deeds and.
No, because we would use
and that
they can
affects
go out
14 to
for
15,000
they can go out for an issue in a month on the Garvey bonds. Isn't that great faith that not only are we funding the design and construction, we're funding construction as well in one single swoop. What greater show of faith to the federal government by saying, now we have money to acquire everything, other than we have $500,000, but we don't have money to acquire the 5.8 or 5.9 left over for the other 6 properties or 7 properties that we have, and that could even delay the closure even longer. But if we had, and we were able to do this Garvey Bond, as Mr. Dominguez says, Gita can do it in a month's time, then we can have the proceeds required for everything. And if I could ask, why does the airport, I guess my question is, why does the airport have to sell the property to the government of Guam? Why can't the airport just dedicate a perpetual public easement? Why does it have to sell the property? Why can't it just say, hey, we will construct the parkway, we'll construct the road using Garvey Bond proceeds. You can keep that as property. You don't have to give us title. We don't need the title. We just need the use. Why does the airport insist, or FAA, have you discussed this, of just dedicating an easement that is accessible to the public? You could even post the sign just like they do at Central Avenue. This is the property of the airport. Pass at your own risk, and construct the road. Why do we need to take $5.8 million and pay it to the airport when I don't believe there's anything that would restrict them from just saying, we're going to leave this open, we're going to allow construction on it, and we're going to allow people to pass at their own risk? Has that been discussed?
Well, Senator, as I was sitting in the hearing room next door, and I remember that I think it was a similar question that was posed to the director of the airport, Chuck Add, at the time, and I recall at that time he was citing and this is when we were talking about trying to return certain airport properties back to
right.
and I think he was talking about there was the federal regulations as well as bond covenants that would restrict that. So to the extent that I don't know, Frank can
I think it was restricting diverting airport revenues and airport assets. But we're not doing anything. I mean, the airport's not doing anything. It's not giving up the property. It's not, it's just saying, hey, this property is available for those that want to pass at their own risk. The government of Guam does not need the title to that property. If the airport board would just say that this property is available and for public thoroughfare at the public's own risk.
I don't think I can answer your question, but I can give you the discussions that we've had with FAA on the issue. And it essentially is that not just FAA, but Federal Highway under an umbrella of the U.S. Department of Transportation. Again, there was properties given to Gulf Guam for the purposes of transportation, which is the parkway. So the FAA is also, as part of the federal government, has taken the position, well, the federal government has already provided land for the property.
I know, Frank, I'm only talking about the airport. Don't worry about the private lands. That will have to resolve in terms of acquisition. But I'm saying, why does the government of Guam need to pay the airport? That property was given for public, for the Teeson Parkway, and that's what the airport's making it available for. It retains title, it retains control, it books it as an asset, and it just says that, hey, people can pass through here.
And
So that we can save that 5.8 and put it in for another road project. But that's the intent of the transfer of the property, was as part of the right-of-way. I just don't see why we're insisting that we buy the property. It's kind of like we're insisting we buy the property. And I'm saying if we don't have to, and the airport can make it open, leave it open, post whatever's required to, you know, protect its liability, and then have the government of Guam, with its own money, build that section, acquire the other sections, and we meet the conditions. And we'll save 5 point, I mean, can you explore that at least? Can we go back and ask that that be explored so that we can get some kind of reading? Because I just think that we don't have to own it. The airport can continue to own it.
Yeah, Senator, I think I just confirmed with Mr. Santos. They've had those discussions with FAA. FAA has not indicated a willingness to do this. And again, every possibility, every alternative, every
Can we get those minutes of the meetings, Frank, where that possibility was discussed?
I mean, all of this has been going on for years. We're coming up against a July deadline where we're told now, you know, we've got Federal Highway saying they have to decide by July if they're going to keep this money intact for phase one. So this is the urgent situation that we are encountering right now.
I know, but the more urgent situation is that what happens when we don't have the rest of the money to acquire those private lands? It doesn't matter. We're being asked to give $500,000, and we don't know what the ultimate cost is going to be. I have the comments of the landowners. I mean, you know, there's no appointed administrator in one landowner, lot number 2087-1. The notes on this thing, instead of Pedro LG and Concepcion Guerrero, no appointed administrator. So they can't act on that. We have to wait for that to acquire that property down the line. Estate of Antonio Borja Leon Guerrero, there's an administrator. Estate of Antonio Borja Leon Guerrero, undetermined. Lot number 2088. All of these are as of April 16. So when I look at all this, you're telling me, oh man, we're almost done. But I look at these comments from the landowners, and we're not anywhere near done. We're not anywhere close to some of these things. There are, as you mentioned, indications of an interest in selling, but again, we have no idea what their price is going to be, and where we're going to end up on this thing. And you're asking us to commit to purchasing one small requirement to save $5.8 million for this project. Again, because that money will be available for other projects. But in order to preserve 5.8, you want us to give you $500,000 that opens up the government of Guam to an unknown amount at this time for what the acquisition costs of all the other lots are going to be. And I really think that that's the intention of the statutes that require that when this legislature approves money for acquisition of land, that we have an idea, that we can, to the greatest degree possible, put a finite number on the resources required by this government, and that we act in accordance with prudence on this thing, rather than we buy that $500,000 and the guys want $21 million for the rest, you know? And where do we go from there? We don't have the money. We don't have 21 million or 10 million for that matter. We don't have 10 million. We don't know where we're going to get it. I think that that's the intention of the requirement, for at least an idea of how much it's going to cost us to acquire each and every required parcel. Because what are we going to do? Realign the road? We acquire one. They want 10 million for all the others. We don't have it. or else it's going to take us 2 years to get it. Central Avenue remains closed. That's why I'm saying, can we look at the Garvey where we somehow are able to get not only the construction costs, but all the other costs?
Senator, how's delaying this for the Garvey going to answer any of the questions that you just brought up about the uncertainty and the acquisition cost of the property going on the phase 2? So even if we wait for Garvey, what's to prevent somebody saying, I want 10 million then?
Well,
at some point in time, Senator, the landowners are going to have to recognize that the government has its restriction based upon appraisal. And
So-
I know we have an incident up at Luzon that didn't turn out the way anybody intended it to do,
Right.
intended to happen. But does that mean then that this body is going to give up the power of eminent domain forever now because of this one instance?
No, but
We
even if
can't
we
run scared because of that as a
even
result.
if we exercise eminent domain, it still requires us to have the appraisals.
Yes.
Right.
I agree.
So give us the appraisals, and we'll give you eminent domain if that's what you want. But the requirement of law says I'm not going to. It's imprudent of me and irresponsible of me to give you $500,000 and a blank check.
Well, but Senator, this $500,000, when you talk about eminent domain and actually the uncertainties, that now there's some uncertainty as a result in this body because of what happened at Luzon, wouldn't it be better to go through a negotiated sale with the landowners, take the appraisals, convince them, have them sign the contract for the purchase and the sale of this property so we don't have to worry about somebody coming back later and asking for $21 million. So that's why we're looking initially, and then also,
Yes,
Senator,
and
quite
that
frankly, I think families also would prefer to be participants in the transfer of their lands rather than to have
and
it
there
taken
is
out from
nothing
underneath
to
them.
there's nothing to prevent you from completing your negotiations. Go complete your negotiations, and then bring back those negotiated prices to this legislature. What's to prevent you from doing that? What is preventing you from doing that right now?
Well, it's the deadline, Senator. We want the $500,000. We go forward. We negotiate the sale. We can close. We got to come back. We still have this July deadline that we have to worry about.
But isn't your negotiations good faith enough with the government, with the federal highway?
Unfortunately not. So trust me, Senator. For everything short of an actual purchase, I have gone and I have tried to negotiate, steps along the way, and we've just kept moving closer and closer to the point where it's pretty evident from FAA's perspective.
So what do we do?
We've got to buy one lot.
So what do we do if we buy that one piece of property for $500,000, and we can't conclude the negotiations for all the rest? Are we going to return it? Are they going to give us our money back?
Then we have to pursue eminent domain.
For all the others.
For all the others.
Which is
if
exactly
all-
what
if
we
all
have,
the others-
which brought us to the Luzon thing. And we could end up being in that situation. You're telling us it's not the same. Well, you're telling me that that's where you're going to go if you can't conclude the negotiations there, which takes us down that same road of an open-ended thing.
No, I'm not telling you it's not the same, Senator. I'm saying that.
One moment, please. I have the Vice Speaker's hand up, Speaker Bend. Is that for?
Just to follow up on
A
the Speaker's
follow-up?
point, I don't know where we get these $3.6 million. That seems to be the lucky number to flag out there as the number that we're going to always have to spend. That was the amount of money that we put into Superior Court for Luzon, and we came out with 26. And I've been back here because maybe I don't know how to use a calculator. I was born with abacus, and it's broken. So I had to do it just from my head and by writing it down. If I'm not mistaken, we're going to pay the airport $5.8 million for 60,000 square meters, right?
With federal funding, yes.
Yeah, no, whatever. It's going to be
5.5 to
5.8 million. If my math is right, there's 125,000 square meters on this list of the 6 properties. Again, my math may be off. That's twice as much property as what you're getting from the airport. But yet, you say all we need is 3.6 million for the rest of the negotiations.
Well,
my math says, like the Speaker's concern is, that what we're going to find out, since we've now publicly announced it to the world that we're paying the airport $100 a square meter, at the very minimum, these guys are going to ask for $100 a square meter, since if you can pay the airport $100 a square meter for land that they got free from the government, that was never theirs to begin with, twice that is going to come up to about $12 million if we pay everybody at
Well,
$98
Vice
a
Speaker,
square meter.
And that was to Senator Limtiaco's questions, the encumbrances and assumptions relative to the parcels. And also, Frank was saying this, are different relative upon the
they have the
conditions
same
of their deeds.
encumbrances, don't they? They also had a
No.
reversionary.
For the land? Yeah, for the
Yes.
road?
Everybody that got deeds in land.
Can you speak into the mic, Mr. Santos? Thank you.
Well, the quitclaim deed that went to the airport was for airport purposes. And in order to, under the FAA regulations, in order to dispose of the land, whether we exchange or we sell the property elsewhere, it requires the concurrence or the approval of the Secretary of Transportation or his designee, which is the FAA.
That's why just avoid all that. Just never transfer the property. Just open it up and let us use it. And the other thing is, the private landowner properties are cliffline properties, so they're going to be more valuable than the airport property, which is not cliffline property.
Senator, we'd sit here and speculate on those numbers, but the appraisals are what's going to control and you talk about the need for appraisals. I mean, you know, at some point we have to rely on the appraisals. And we're relying, right now, we have the benefit of an appraisal, draft appraisal that was done last year. Those are the numbers upon which we are guiding ourselves because of the July deadline that we're faced with.
And
we're
that's
looking
why
at
we
trying to
want it now. Because
And we don't have
want
any
to
of
make-
that, Art. Why are you the only ones? Why should you be? You're asking us to make a decision. You have all of that information. We don't have any of it. The
But
governor should have at least submitted
isn't
those
the-
information down to the legislature.
But we're not saying anything different, Senator. You want us to be guided by the appraisals, and we've been here for an hour telling you we are waiting for the appraisal to guide us.
Well,
on
but
what
you
the- what
you
the sales
say you
price
have
is.
all your draft appraisals. Why can't we have the draft appraisals?
Okay.
Point of order real quick,
Okay.
Madam Chair. I
Yes,
think we need to clarify this because this discussion
Yes.
keeps going on about appraisals, and
I
I don't think
understand that.
appraisals apply
Yes.
to private property acquisition. So I think we need to clear that up real quick. Because if we're talking government, I can understand, or leases, and the statute's clear, but we're buying private property here.
No, it does
Director?
require it. I must apologize, but maybe
What
Mr.
was
Clark
the
and I
ci-
can
the
agree
cite-
on that.
what was the
That if
cite-
we're
no.
going to acquire private property, we are required to have appraisals.
I'm sorry, Senator, what was the citation you gave, 2 GCA? Or
Yeah, 2107,
2107, 2 GCA?
2 GCA, Chapter 2.
Okay. So I do have Senator Limtiaco.
The question is for Mr. Dominguez. Just going back to the Garvey Bond discussions, and Speaker Pangilinan had mentioned using those proceeds. Can you just explain to us how is the repayment of the Garvey bonds going to be funded?
The repayment of the Garvey bonds, 100% of the annual payments, and I think we were looking at a 12-year payback, would be 100% federal highway funds.
Okay, so this just goes back to the prior discussion about whether or not the federal government will use federal funds to buy back property that they gave back to the government of Guam. So can the Garvey bonds even be used to purchase the land back? Because if the logic is right, the federal funds can be used to purchase it back. I don't understand how the bond would make any different whether you floated it and used federal funds to pay for it.
The federal highway representative out of Honolulu has told me repeatedly that federal highways will not allow federal dollars or the Garvey bond to reacquire those private properties in phase 2.
Okay, so local funds must be used to repurchase the land in question, these lots in question for these lots. Federal
Presumably-
funds, whether they're
Presumably because the federal highway will not allow a penny of their money to be spent on to reacquire the property.
okay, thank you. And then, Mr. Clark, just to follow up on the need for the appraisals. Once again, the value and the appraisal of the property is predicated on any encumbrances that exist with the title. So if there's a reversionary clause that says you cannot use this property unless you build a road on it, that's going to affect the value. So the value for the current phase 2 or phase 1 airport property does not have that reversionary clause. Or is
no,
it, or I
phase 2
should say,
does have the reversionary clause. Phase 1 was property that was dedicated for airport purposes. So yes, so
correct.
if-
Sorry about
right.
yeah, I got the two mixed up. So just to be clear, the appraisals are going to be based on whether or not there are any encumbrances on that property, and therefore it could negatively reduce the cost of those properties or the
Yes.
value of those properties.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
So, yeah, I mean, with Phase 2 property, with the fact that, you know, the requirement for the road is there and there isn't a road on the property, anybody buying that property is going to buy it with the knowledge that the federal government can come back and take it from you tomorrow. So you have to price in what is the value of that property to you, knowing that there's a clause in the deed that says the federal government can come back and revert it back to them, you know, the day after you buy it.
But I also want to
Senator
point out,
Pena, you're
thank you. I
recognized.
also want to point out that even the properties under the ancestral lands have that reversionary clause. So in the return of ancestral lands, the original deed by the federal government had this reversionary clause, and yet those properties have been bought and sold on the open market at fair market value. All the properties along Route 3 in Nick Tam's area, those properties, actually some of them have changed hands twice since they were returned to the original landowners. And those were sold
What was the reversionary interest on Route 3?
on Route 3,
What was the reversionary interest?
that the federal government can take
revert
that back.
No, there has to be a trigger event. I'm sorry, I'm not familiar with the trigger event for the reversionary interest.
They
on
were
Route
given
3.
to the government of Guam with a reversionary clause.
Right, but do you know
Right.
what the,
Yeah. Public benefit. So there is, you know, there's that same kind of encumbrance or position. Now, the one thing I wanted to kind of go back with a statement that was kind of glossed over was that the sale of the remnants is going to fund the acquisition of the rest of the private property. So who are we going to sell these properties to? Because my understanding, according to some information I have, was GovGuam is going to come in, acquire these properties at a reduced value because of this encumbrances, and then GovGuam was going to sell it back to the airport?
airport, I'm sorry.
The airport will purchase it from GovGuam.
So at fair market value,
Yes. Yes.
without encumbrances?
Well, the encumbrances have been removed because it's now being
So
used.
the government's going to be in the business of flipping property. We're going to undercut the private landowner, depress the value of his property and not pay him what it's worth. Go back. Now, because the government owns it, it's going to sell it to the airport, and the airport's going to pay $120 a square meter while we pay the landowner 30, 20, 10?
Understood, Senator. But
No, I don't understand that.
I understand.
Senator, you know, it's the same as somebody goes out and buys agriculture, its own property, and puts millions of dollars into the infrastructure, into rezoning it, and turns around, increases the value of the property. This property, its value is depreciated because of the reversionary provision relative to the building of a road. So when the road goes in, after the expenditure of millions of dollars to put the road in, that's when the value of the property goes up. And that's when the airport's interest in the property would manifest itself. And so as the result of doing this also, we're looking at the difference of being able to purchase or spend, I guess, about $3.5 to $5 million versus $10 to $15 million. But also reading 2107, and I'm still trying to go through it and listen to the conversation at the same time, but I do note that 2107A does apply to government land specifically. So I'm still trying to read through the rest of it.
How about B?
Yeah, so, well, I'm getting to that right now. So. And trying to listen to the conversation, so I'm having a hard time doing that, sorry.
Senator Frank Huggen.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. You know, it was a very interesting comment on the part of the previous speaker in terms of asking or posing the question, why do we need to invest or spend $5.8 million of government of Guam funds or Federal Highway Administration funds to purchase a government asset? And I'd like to follow up on just on that thought, and please, if I can get the airport officials to provide responses. You know, is there any situation today or in the past where, in fact, the airport facility has been lent or for use by a government entity without any lease obligation?
Was there an event?
Any
Yeah.
situation in which the airport is leasing to either local government entities or federal government entities without requiring lease payment?
During the initial years of the BRAC turnover, I say before the airport got title, and for some agencies, a few years after title.
Okay, what about today?
There's
Are
no.
there any federal or local entities that are utilizing airport property without being obligated to pay lease?
None from local agencies, but the federal agencies are utilizing airport property for the purposes of air navigation
Okay,
at no cost.
at no cost. We understand that. So looking at the airport authority, has the airport authority, through legislation by this body over the course of the last 20 years, benefited from the transfer of property without any fees being assessed?
Can you clarify, Senator?
Has there ever been any property adjacent to the airport given to the airport facility by the government of Guam through this legislative body for use by the airport
For use by the airport.
without any fees?
Yes, when the airport authority was first established.
What about since BRAC?
Since BRAC, no properties that
So
I'm aware of.
none of the adjacent properties identified as part of the BRAC use was extended or given or transferred ownership to the airport authority for airport purposes.
No, Senator.
And I guess the thought I'm trying to share here, Madam Chair, is there are situations where FAA, as the federal authorizing entity, and obviously we know it's a federal statute, where federal agencies that are presently utilizing space at the airport authority have a memorandum of agreement that they will be provided space without lease payments or obligations in exchange for providing those services. And I'm trying to lead to this, back to this idea, this question that now is implanted, or the thought that now is implanted in my mind, as to why would we as a community have to invest and purchase assets from another government of Guam entity without looking and exploring seriously at the option that was proffered, the thought that was proffered by the speaker. And that is sitting down with FAA and saying, we are not looking at transferring title. Once you transfer title, I understand your bond covenants kick in, as well as FAA has to concur. So you have to either sell or lease that property. But without transferring title, has that idea ever been proffered to the FAA officials in regards to public use and benefits? And I bring this up because part of the presentation is the $59 million of economic benefits within that general area, the cargo facilities and whatnot at the airport authority. That being said, it only makes prudent sense that not only is the airport able to expand to the 12,000 foot runway, but also to be able to provide public access and easement, perhaps without having to sell the parcel of property to another government of Guam entity. And in exchange for that, obviously, those resources that otherwise would have been used to pay for your railway assets at the airport can be applied elsewhere to benefit this island community. So I'm just asking that question, has that issue ever been proffered without the exchange of title in terms of possible public use of that property?
Yes, it has been discussed with the FAA in terms of how we can provide access from Route 8 to Tizen, North Tizen, and to the airport.
Well, the issue with regards to whether, in fact, Mr. Santos, I know you know where I'm going with this, and I appreciate your responses. The issue has been presented to FAA officials that how can we work this so that, in fact, DPW the people of Guam benefit as a result of access to the property. Obviously, FAA is going to say it's real property, you have to sell it at fair market value. One response. But then has the question ever been posed, without transferring authority, could that parcel of property be utilized specifically to provide cross-island access, or actually Route 8 to Route 1, without a cost to the people of Guam and without transferring title? That's the specific question, Mr. Santos. I understand your previous response. And it's just a regurgitation of the direct question I'm asking you. Has that idea ever been proffered to the FAA officials?
Yes, it has.
And their response was?
And Senator, I was in those meetings, so at the time
Sure.
the director was Joanne Brown, and trust me, she was very vocal about this whole thing. She was very vocal about this in these meetings that we held at the airport's board meeting on this very issue. And we didn't get any movement from FAA on that. And then your other question also about, I'm also aware of some federal agencies up at the airport who are not paying rent, but that's by federal law. There's
I did recognize that.
federal
In fact,
regulations
there's federal statutes that
mandate
dictate that these federal entities have to be provided.
Yes, and the reason I know that is because I'm trying to figure out some way to get the Guam entities also that must be up there, like customs, to fit with under this umbrella. So that's an issue I'm sensitive to also and have been looking at. But I do know there is federal regulations that require that. That's why.
Yeah. That's one of the reasons why, coming from a federal entity, FAA, acknowledging that in fact another federal entity by federal statute, and I did qualify my statement, by federal statute is authorized to utilize space at the airport authority based on their requirements and their needs. But then I'm trying to cross-apply that to the general public, the people of Guam, in terms of the possible use of this property. I appreciate you sharing with me that perhaps that idea, I still haven't gotten a good sense that concept was proffered without the exchange of title, because anytime, and it goes back to what I just said with Mr. Santos, anytime you're exchanging title, there's an automatic clause. You have to sell or you have to lease that parcel of property.
My recollection is that the easement issue came up in that conversation also without the exchange of title. And I don't know if Jim and Carl, who are in the meeting, also have any different or similar recollections. But I do remember former Senator Brown, former Director Brown, was very adamant on this particular issue and was pounding the table.
Then one more follow-on question, Mr. Speaker, if I may, is has the issue ever been elevated to, let me say, for the airport or DPW, to your boss, so that he can communicate on behalf of the people of Guam to FAA officials or the President of the United States or the U.S. Department of Transportation? Has that issue, because obviously at certain levels, yes, there can be frank and no pun intended, direct discussions, but once it's elevated to a different level, it's given that much more importance in terms of providing the accommodation to the local community. Has this issue ever been elevated to your bosses?
Although I wasn't in the meeting, I understand that the former governor, the past governor, had met with USDOT on this issue, but not. The FAA did not back down in terms of our obligations.
Because the request at that time was transfer of property. And what I'm sharing with you is not transfer of title, but retention of title, but public use. And that's really where the difference comes in. So I appreciate the discussion and the responses. I did not get the assurance that if in fact this issue would have been elevated, that we would most likely have received the consent. And I'm of this opinion, that we would have most likely received the consent of the federal authorities to be able to allow use, because it ultimately benefits the airport in terms of your economic contribution to our entire island community. If you're expanding that highway to 4 lanes possibly, or just upgrading it, at the end of the day, it's part of your story. $59 million of possible economic activity coming out of the airport, and it's only going to benefit the airport, it's only going to benefit the public. And I think that that's certainly an issue or an approach that should be, despite action on this proposal, really should be elevated to a different level so that at least it would be given due consideration. Because otherwise, that's millions of dollars of local funds or federal support funds that could be applied towards other projects on Guam. So just a food for thought. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you.
Mr. Speaker, can I add just a little bit of context here also? Again, the focus here is this July deadline with the Federal Highway. We had monthly conference calls scheduled with FAA, Federal Highway, DPW, Airport, and the Governor's Office participating in these calls. And Federal Highway got so frustrated that we've made no progress in this, that they actually refused. They refused to attend these meetings. And I want to say over the months of November, December, and January, maybe even longer. So I remember we had a 3-4 month window there where all discussions, all negotiations had just really come to a grinding halt. And so when Federal Highway says they're really kind of tired of keeping this money tied up and it's time to move, and they give us a July deadline, we have reason to take that very serious and believe that we need to get this locked up in time for them to report back that the project's still moving forward.
Just so that, Mr. Speaker, if I may, I mean, in regards to the time-sensitive nature of this proposal, I support it.
Thank you.
So at least it will get the process to proceed. But I'm just saying the window of opportunity to elevate the issue to a different level is still there. And if, in fact, on a serious note, if representatives from either DPW or the airport can elevate it to your boss, and please see if, in fact, he can communicate with the proper authorities, federal authorities, from executive branch to executive branch, I would like to think that, in fact, perhaps the responses may be different in terms of retaining title, but allowing for public use of that particular, I guess, preemptive runway that's going to be taking place down the road. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you very much, Senator Ogden. I have Senator Dueñas and then Senator Tomata.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Excuse me for maybe an oversimplification of this issue. This sounds like a great roundtable here. We're here to discuss the matter of this appropriation measure. And this appropriation measure starting the discussion for all of the other things we're discussing here, because Art, don't you see this as, if we don't at least take this step, it's a non-starter for the entire process, and we're just in the same position we continue to be in, wrapped around the axle and making a critical decision here on this very important thoroughfare to the people of Guam.
Senator, to be more accurate, I see it as several steps backwards from where we are today, because the money is off the table. Central Avenue is closed. 15,000 cars are all, they're not able to traverse it, and they're going down Route 1, Route 8, causing additional congestion. And again, then we don't know when we'll be able to find the $5.8 million. Maybe next year's Garvey, maybe not. But yeah, so to answer your question, actually, I see it as moving backward, not keeping status quo.
Okay, Mr. Clark, not an oversimplification once again of, and I don't want to dispute the transfer of land, whether it be forcible or non-forcible, with required, the statute cited for the purposes of the appraisals. I know that you are perfectly understanding, engaging, and willing to do that. We have in this bill a provision that I don't like in particular, but it's there. Notwithstanding any other provision of law, which starts line 2 on page 1, section 1. We also have a reporting requirement on line 16, page 2, section 3. Reporting requirement: the Director of the Department of Public Works shall submit a report to Magallanes Guahan y Legislature in Guahan no later than 180 days following the enactment of this act, detailing all transactions pertaining to the funds appropriated therein. Now, I doubt very much this body would pass and the governor sign this appropriation measures without knowing full well, and you as his legal counsel would assure the public right now that you will do what the law requires for the purposes of executing the transaction proposed within this bill. Is that correct? Which would include the 2 appraisals prior to your moving forward.
Yes, Senator.
I needed to know that prior to voting on this bill. Thank you, Mr. Clark.
Thank you very much, Senator Dueñas. Senator Tomata.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to go back to the idea that was proffered by the gentleman from Barrigada, by the chairman actually, about why does DPW have to pay 5.8 million to the airport to acquire that Phase 1 property. And I think the suggestion certainly would be very valid, and if we were using, in fact, local DPW money to buy lands from the airport. But I think that in reality, what we're talking about here is we're talking about two Department of Transportation agencies who are flexing their muscles, and we're just bystanders. So you have Federal Highway, who is willing to provide the $5.8 million to buy the Phase 1 property, but you've got somebody like FAA who's basically saying, no, because we want to use that $5.8 million to do other airport expansion projects. And so I guess for me that's the frustrating part, because as much as good an idea and the argument that the gentleman from Barrigada was making, the fact of the matter is that we're talking about monies that belong to federal agencies, and we have no say as to how they exercise those authorities. And FAA, of course, has a big muscle in this game because they are a large grantor to the airport, and that's just the reality. As much as I find it nauseating that they've got that kind of a grip on us, but they do. So I just wanted to basically express that really we're talking at the wrong level regarding how those monies are pushed around.
Thank you very much, Senator Ada. Senator Rodriguez-Pichar.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I just want to follow up on a dialogue between Mr. Clark and Senator Dueñas when he pointed out the notwithstanding provision and how this appropriation, if passed, will be available and how it be expended. He asked the panel if they would still follow through with the requirement of law to provide the two appraisals. The way I'm reading this is if this notwithstanding provision would no longer make those two appraisals a requirement of this appropriation. And so in response to his question, when he asked, Arthur, when he asked you if you would make sure that the government of Guam did the two appraisals pursuant to law, doesn't this notwithstanding other provision of law no longer make that a requirement?
Actually, Senator, that's a very good reading. I'm still trying to encourage you to go to law school at some point in time, but that's a very good reading, and I don't think that's an unreasonable reading. That this might supersede that requirement.
And then my second observation, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Chairman, is on the reporting requirement. The reporting requirement is just relative to the dollar amount, not relative to whether or not you did all the due diligence with respect to the appraisals. And when I was telling Senator Dueñas, he said to me, well, that's true, I could see that. Well, do we want to go back then and make the two appraisals the requirement? We've done it before. We didn't waive the appraisal requirement. We said that the appraisals are still required prior to this transaction being transacted. So maybe we can have some discussion, because I just don't like this notwithstanding the provision of law, because you could be throwing out all other requirements, as the good speaker pointed out earlier, and as we've talked about for the last 2 hours, 2.5 hours.
Yes, I agree. I think that we depending on the wish of the body and each individual member, but I would certainly the chair would entertain any amendments that may be offered by any member of the body. Unless we're, that could be appropriate. It will be at any time during the committee of the whole, any member may decide to offer an amendment. Okay. Okay. Are you, Senator?
Do you want to take a recess, Mr. Speaker?
Okay. All right. The committee of the whole would request will hold a recess at this time. Thank you very much. We're going to just allow the panel the body to ask any final questions of the panel here, and then we'll dismiss them, and then the body will deliberate on additional actions it wishes to take on the matter before it. Senator
Yeah,
Respicio?
thank you, Mr. Speaker. I don't believe there are any more questions of the panel other than the matters that we have to resolve on a dialogue between Senator Duenas and Attorney Clark. So I then move that we...
no. Yeah.
I was going to move to dismiss the panel and to reiterate all the requirements of the panel regarding the documents and maybe the draft appraisal and other things that we talked about over the last 3 hours, Mr. Speaker, that they make those documents available for our review, and that we just recess till 3 p.m. tomorrow.
Senator Ada, before I entertain that motion.
We call Department of Administration in here to put on the record whether in fact there's funds.
Yes. I would like to then have the Department of Administration comment on the funding. As you know, the funding is from these cheat funds, and there has been public statements from actually the administration that those funds are the funds to be used for the increments and funding. So we could just get a comment from the Department of Administration to Senator Ada's question.
Yes. Yes, Senator. Yes, we have these cheat funds that are available for appropriation. We have the $500,000 is the funding source for the Teason Parkway, and as well as I guess Senator Pangilinan and I, we had a conversation, and we spoke about the increments for the line agencies and DOE. We also the $4.8 million is for the increments. For the line agencies and DOE as well.
So the total requirement to fund the increments have not been fully determined at this time. Is that correct?
Well, I'm sorry.
The total dollar
amounts,
amount of the cost of the increments have not been finalized?
We're working on that right now. We're working on that right now.
Can we get that by tomorrow?
I'm out tomorrow, but I know that our HR personnel as well as our payroll people were working on that, and we also asked DOE about their amounts as well. So.
Okay. All right. So please attempt to get us.
Yes. So whatever I have, I can give it to you.
Okay. Any other questions for the panel? If not, we'd like to excuse the panel, but also request them to be available tomorrow also as well. Okay. So we'll dismiss the panel at this time, and then we'll entertain the motion by the majority leader.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and our appreciation to members of this panel for all the discussion relative to this issue. So I move, Mr. Speaker, that we recess until 3 p.m. tomorrow.
All right.
And that we do remain in the committee of the whole.
All right. On the motion to recess till 3 p.m. tomorrow and then come back to the committee of the whole, no objections? Motion to recess.